Good afternoon, everyone. I think I can't be seen. Please just give us a moment while I speak to my technical team. I think no one can see me. Can you guys see me?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let me just talk to my technical people. Thank you very much. Well, first, let me just welcome our guests so much. And for those of you who are watching us on Facebook and live, I've got two very exciting guests with me today. I've got Dr. Co-Pierre Georg, who is the chair of the Reserve Bank Financial Stabilities Study in the University of Cape Town, as well as Dr. Sthembile Mbete, who is a international relations lecturer at the University of Pretoria, but also I'm sure many of you would have seen her on numerous times on television giving her analysis on the state of our economy and the governments generally in South Africa. So I'm very excited to have such esteemed guests with me, and I think it's really important because one of the things that I've really been saying in my entire campaign is it's one thing for us as a political party or as politicians or as leaders to speak about the ideas that we have, but it's incredibly important that we're making sure that we're touching base with the experts, people who do this for a living on a daily basis, to substantiate whether we're going in the right direction and to really help give us ideas on how to get things happening in our country. And obviously I've said as leader that this is something that I wanted to be doing far more of, because I think that we don't lean enough into the experts that are working in these fields. So I'm very excited to have both these amazing professionals with me today. And I'm really going to be speaking on a number of issues that I would like to pick their brains on, but also because I think it's really important for us as South Africans to understand the economy in a way that is a little more accessible. I think we would have seen, even when the president gave his economic recovery plan, it was so far above everyone's heads that people end up not understanding what is really going on with our economy and how we can really sort out things. So that's why I have these two amazing people to speak about that. And I want to focus particularly on the poor, how we make our economy something that can really work. And unfortunately, because it's in such a bad state now, what it is that we can do as soon as possible to try and alleviate some of the problems that we see. So I think, just to get into it, could I ask maybe you, Co-Pierre, and then you, Dr. Mbete, just to let us know a little bit about the work that you do and just what you're passionate about, particularly around this topic, before we delve into some of the questions that I have. I'll start with you, Professor.
Hey, how's it? Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So my name is Co-Pierre. I'm an associate professor at UCT, where I'm the course convener for our MPhil in financial technology. And what we do is we take sort of the best and the brightest students. We impart some hard knowledge on them, especially hard coding skills and development skills and a little bit of finance. And then we encourage them to start their own companies out of our program to sort of show the innovative spirit that exists in South Africa and sort of bring it to fruition and just help grow the economy. I'm also the South African Reserve Bank chair, and in that role, my work is mostly around financial stability challenges in South Africa, which at the moment, luckily, sort of things seem stable, but the economy in the position that it is, there's a couple of sort of warning signs on the horizon that even from a financial stability perspective, we need to be very vigilant about. And between the two things, that's basically my day.
Awesome. Thank you. And Dr. Mbete? Oh, we can't hear you.
I don't know why my mic isn't working. So I'm just taking that off. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, where I'm also the coordinator for the Bachelor of Political Science in International Relations. I teach both international relations at undergraduate level, and also I teach in our Masters of Diplomatic Studies. And I also have an interest in political science, particularly around elections and political parties, and am part of a global working group looking at populism and the growth of populism across the world.
Thank you. I think I might want to sign up for that course. It sounds easier than Dr. Co-Pierre George's course. Okay, well, maybe we could just get into it. I think we've just had COVID, and I think it's exposed to many of us really even more so how unequal our economy as our society is, and really the kinds of interventions that we should be taking at this point, and what can we do. And I speak particularly as somebody who is younger than the majority of politicians in our country, who may not be around to see the mistakes that they've made really come and be something that we'll have to then deal with. So let me start with you, Professor Georg. How would you characterize our South African economy at the moment, and what do you think the economic forecast is, I suppose, in the immediate future, but if we don't change things, really what's going to happen? And I'm not asking that just in general terms. I'd really like you to just explain it to people what it is that we can expect. You unmute.
That's the classic in the Zoom calls now. I think the situation at the moment is quite dire. I mean, we've seen the economic, sort of the GDP forecasts and the current growth estimates with I think it was 51% drop in GDP, which I have never heard of in any country that hasn't afterwards gone through some fairly violent transitions. So this is something that we need to be very worried about. It's not a sustainable trajectory that we are on. And I think the difficulty comes mainly from having spent too much in the past and not spent it wisely enough. And this is a really dangerous combination. At the moment, we've been hit by the pandemic, which has really sort of revealed the rift that exists in society. You know, the reason why our property market has not completely collapsed is because those who can are now moving out into larger places with a little bit of a garden and sort of, you know, just ride out the storm and wait COVID is over, while there's a large part of the population who don't know how to put bread on the table, who don't know how to feed their children, who don't know how to send them to school. So there's really the fault lines that existed in society. I think COVID has just amplified them. And it is going to be a generational challenge just to fix this one problem on top of the problems that we had before. The main difficulty is that normally in a situation like this, countries would invest heavily in infrastructure, in sort of innovation. We can't do that because we are what's called fiscally constrained. What this means is if the South African government goes to international markets to borrow more money, they have a very difficult time. We already have quite high interest rates on our government borrowing, which means that we are spending a disproportionately large proportion of our tax revenue every year already on things that have been borrowed in the past. And we are constrained. So the normal reaction that countries would do, and countries have done all over the world with sort of expansionary spending, it's not a path that we can easily follow. So we need to now, I think, take very hard decisions around how we are spending money and whether the sort of the growth model that we have in mind, whether this is really the right trajectory to follow, or, and that's where I think we need to have a very honest discussion with South Africans, whether the model that we've sort of promised over the past 20, 30 years, whether this model actually doesn't work in our circumstances, and we need to come up with a new model and with new ideas on how to fix the economy.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that because I think that that's exactly what we have to now decide as a society and take that hard decision now and follow on and on. But Dr. Mbete, I'm interested in you coming in from a political perspective, both on our political parties, but also the political landscape, predominantly since 1994. What do you think, I suppose, has led to the socioeconomic and political landscape do we see? And also, if you could just touch even just on our political parties, because I think even though I'm a part of one, it's important to get your critical critique of where we are also all going wrong, because many South Africans continue to say that they don't see a political party that talks to them, whether just in terms of the economy or anything else. So I'd be interested in just your views on that.
I think that what South Africa really has faced since 1994, since 1990, with the beginning of the transition, is a set of options, or there was a choice made about economic policies and priorities around socioeconomic spending from 1994 that didn't actually match the lived conditions of the majority of South Africans, and industries that were prioritized for growth and expansion, industries like the finance industry, retail, some parts of construction weren't really the industries that were going to absorb the very large number of job seekers that were joining the job market, but also aren't the kinds of industries that can achieve the necessary generational wealth building and economic development that the majority of South Africans had been excluded from for the majority of the country's history. And so while we had a period of pretty good growth, economic growth between 1998, 99 to about 2007, 2008, that wasn't growth that was creating the kinds of jobs that we needed, but it also wasn't growth that was making the majority of people feel that their lives were actually improving.
Yeah.
If anything, people that were in relatively low-skilled industrial work like clothing manufacturing and other things felt that their lives actually got worse because they lost their jobs. And so there's been a mismatch between the policies that have been implemented and the actual needs of people. And I think that none of our political parties have been able to provide policies or to provide a vision that makes people feel like their lived condition is going to be improved.
That their lived realities are seen and that we understand why they are in the space that they're at because of the reasons, some of our past and some of the mismatch of our policies that you speak to. And that's something that I've said quite clearly, is that political parties need to reach people where they are, not only to talk about, you know, how they'd like things to be, because I think that that's something that we continuously see from our political parties. There's a lot of platitudes, and I don't think that all of them are not well-meaning, but, you know, people want to know how to put bread on the table. So, Professor Georg, you've already spoken a little bit about COVID-19 exposing the cracks in our society. And I think where you were going with, in terms of the model that we've sort of taken on in South Africa, is sort of the idea of consumption-led growth. And I don't know if that's something that South Africa should be following because, well, we spend a lot, we don't save, and it seems like we become in this continual cycle of not being able to get ourselves out. And as Dr. Mbete says, we can't even get to the generational kind of wealth that we want to see, being able to replace the cycles of poverty and violence, quite frankly, that we see. So is consumption-led growth still something that we should be trying to follow as a model for South Africa, or what is it that we're supposed to be looking at now? What can I do as somebody who is in the political space to try and push for an agenda that's going to actually transform structurally our economy?
I think the most important thing is that we need an honest assessment of where we are heading in terms of really big picture trends. And these really big picture trends come from the change in the work environment, the sort of the growth model that we had back in 2007, the jobs that we created up until 2007, 2008. These were, I want to say, 20th century jobs, but a lot of them were actually 19th century jobs. We're not in the 19th or the 20th century anymore. The challenge that we are facing is that new technologies like artificial intelligence are replacing jobs in the services industry. When we launched our fintech program, we went to see the CTOs of all the big banks in South Africa, and we had a chat like, what are the skills you need? What do you want us to create as an employee of the future, basically? What they told us across the board is we are very excited about these new technologies, including AI, because they allow us to do things that require hundreds of people right now with a simple piece of software. And that is an unprecedented challenge that we are facing, where the skills that we've imparted on previous generations are very difficult to solve the problems that the world with this future technology will be facing. And it's, even for universities, it's very difficult for us to change the way we do things in order to sort of be more future oriented. But in particular for the politicians, it's important to understand that these changes that are happening are not unique to South Africa. The job losses that we are seeing is not just because of bad management. There's that part of it. But we need to address the changing work environment where, so if you don't just have one career for your entire life, you have several careers, you have sort of gigs that line up next to one another, sometimes in parallel. You need to embark on lifelong learning journeys to be ready for these future skills. We are doing none of this at the moment. We are still living in this 20th century that sort of previous generations have sort of glorified, because that's when they were young, and it's not going to come back. So this idea of we can buy our way out of the current economic problem is just not going to happen, because the way we consume is directing funds out of the country. So when you just go and you go to any supermarket and you look through what's out there, there's basic goods that you can buy that are made in South Africa. As soon as you go to more complex products, be it sort of appliances, be it anything that is a bit more complex, you very easily have to buy from overseas. And the reason for that is that we don't have the skills in the country to do these kind of complex products. And as a consequence, whenever we spend based on consumption, we spend money overseas. Yeah. And we don't grow jobs at home. And this is a fundamental problem that South Africans need to get to grips with, that we need to create these local value chains.
Right. And so I'm a young man, Mlazi. I haven't got a university education. I haven't got any skills to really speak of in terms of how to be in this 21st century job market. What am I supposed to do? What is the government supposed to do to help absorb me into the job market? Must I go be somebody who works on a farm? How am I supposed to be able to contribute in a way that will give me some semblance of dignity in this new world?
I mean, one thing I can add to that is we need to fix our TVET college system. They have such an important role, and I don't understand why we long haven't done this. I'm originally from Germany. We have a TVET college system as well, with the Fachhochschulen that really specialize in the mixture of highly technical skills as well as sort of tradecraft. And there's sort of an interim between this and the purely academic education that you tend to get at our normal universities. And this is absolutely crucial for the whole German SMME sector, which is world leading in its production. And it's because the skills are built at exactly that level, that are not quite academic, but that are not purely tradecraft. That's what's missing. We have some good TVET colleges, don't get me wrong, but it's not, as a sector, it's not supported enough. It's not well respected enough. I know many students who say they would never go to a TVET colleges. You know, that's where you go when you have no other options. And I think it's the wrong perception. These TVET colleges have an absolutely crucial role in creating exactly that, the kind of jobs that can't be automated. And these are jobs that are complex, that have a high amount of manual work in it, and that are sort of labor intensive. And that's exactly where they can provide a role. But the government is lacking this vision, I think, for how to make them the engines of future job growth in the country.
I agree. And Dr. Mbete, I'd like you to come in here, because I think you saw the president's speech last week. And I felt, and maybe it's going towards what Professor Georg just said, but also just in general, there doesn't seem to be a way that we can also absorb our informal economy. And being such a huge part of the South African economy that isn't always taken into account. I'd be interested in your thoughts about, one, the president's speech and just what you thought of it, but secondly, maybe the idea of how we can get our informal economy to be assisted to really, I think, find itself in a space in the state that it can contribute more to the economy, and that we can make it a job grower as well. And I speak as someone who has gone through school and university and everything because my parents were in a large part of the informal economy. So I speak about things that I see, things that I've grown up with. And to me, it's crazy, and it's been a big part of my manifesto that we should be talking about how we can help the sector become, more finance, if that's what they need, or whatever it is that they might need to be able to be more competitive and productive. But maybe you could just give us your thoughts on those two particular things.
Certainly, and I just want to reinforce what Prof. Georg said around TVET colleges. And I mean, it's always quite remarkable to me as somebody who works at a university, how little we talk about the role of TVET colleges as part of the tertiary education sector, and how under-resourced a lot of TVET colleges are in terms of the equipment that they need, in terms of the staff that they need. And TVET colleges, a lot of their education relies on building relationships with industry. And that aspect of the economy gets lost in the conversations that we have around job creation, around industrialization. And I think that which leads me then to my response to the president's speech, is that there is a very old-fashioned idea of what the economy actually is and what work looks like, what valuable economic looks like. And you saw that in the president's speech in terms of where the focus was on investment. So looking at infrastructure spend, okay, cool, good, but also talking about revitalizing mining and revitalizing manufacturing, and promoting tourism and leisure and entertainment. And the reality is that firstly, the mining industry and the mining sector is a declining one. Yes, we still have a lot of mineral resources, but in terms of the environmental impact and the quality of the work, we can't continue to rely on mining as the bulk employer of people in South Africa. For the primary activity of getting minerals out of the ground, if you're not going to think then about, well, what other processing activities can you think about in the kinds of industries that the professor was speaking about earlier. We know, for example, that tourism is going to take a long time to recover globally. It's not just a South African problem because of COVID-19. So why hinge so much of your economic recovery in the short term on the growth of the tourism industry, which structurally just cannot happen? And so there was a lot of things that the president was saying that seemed like a kind of recycling of old plans, and hoping that if we implement the plans that we introduced 4 years ago now, then it'll be okay, but with no recognition that the circumstances have changed so fundamentally because of this pandemic and its effect on the global economy that you can't say that you want to use old plans. You need to think up something completely new. And so there was a lot of that missing. And the other thing for me that was missing from the president's speech is that many of the blockages in our ability to grow the economy in the past few years, including spectrum auctions and actually making sure that we have enough broadband to expand to the 4IR, but also talking about electricity capacity. The policies and the plans are all the same. There was no conversation about what's going to be done differently this time to make sure that things are actually implementable. And until we unlock that, we're going to keep having the same conversation year after year, because we're not talking about what is it that is making it impossible for things to be implemented. And I think that's what we need to focus on.
Let me jump in there. So why do you think this keeps happening? Because I mean, it's the same thing that I see, is that we keep having the same platitudes. But is it an inability for our government leaders to understand that there needs to be a change? Do they just not know? Is it a question, like Dr. Georg, that Professor Georg said, of just people haven't realized that we're in a different century? why do we have governments and government leaders that seem to not understand something as simple as what you are talking about, and that has been spoken about, and certainly even myself, who's not an economist, can see as plain as day? Why do we have this blockage? Is it just because we have an alliance that is also incredibly unable to negotiate its own shared values? How are we having this conversation year after year, MTF after MTF? I mean,
I think a big problem for it in terms of politics is that the short-term decisions, the decisions that need to be made in the short term for these long-term gains, don't offer a big enough short-term political payoff. And a lot of the blockages are actually caused by internal political dynamics within the ANC. So some people's interests won't be met by the spectrum auction happening before 2020. So then it gets delayed and postponed again until 2021. And so until you can have a different internal conversation about what the political payoffs are going to be, I think that we're going to be stuck in this position. And I think that what also hasn't been the case until now, and I don't think this is going to last for very long, is that there hasn't been a big enough push from outside of the political party, from society in general, to really make clear the urgency of making some of these decisions. So there's no immediate threat. There hasn't been an immediate threat of revolution or of collapse of governance at the micro level, or people saying, well, we're just going to stop obeying all laws. And until that kind of threat is there in a credible way, or until there's a credible threat of losing power, so people saying, actually, we're just going to vote for someone else. And we started to see a little bit of that in 2016. It's going to be very difficult to create the incentive for people to think more broadly about their political interests and not just about what's happening within the party.
I completely agree, anarchy. But also, I genuinely think that it's also up to the working and middle class, if we really have one in South Africa, because it can't be left up, I think, to people who are already worried about what they're going to have on the table. It's just not sustainable to have people that are the poorest in society trying to wage this war of the urgency of what we need to change. It has to actually come from us, which is why, for me, as somebody who's running to be a political leader, at the very key focus of what the DA needs to do is to get society really mad about what's happening, and not mad in a hysterical sense, but mad to take action. And even if it isn't towards voting for the DA, but really getting our governments to be scared and really getting them below 50%, because otherwise we're going to be this frog boiling system for a while. So, I mean, Professor George, we've spoken a little bit about the barriers, and I think Dr. Mbete said, what some of the barriers are in terms of the politics of the country. Do you want to just come in here just about some of the barriers that exist in terms of like our actual economic growth? So yes, we don't have TVETs, we don't have skills, but are there other barriers? And for me, as a young person, it seems that it would be impossible to start a business unless you're somebody, for example, that already has the means, firstly. Secondly, I'm also not maybe the kind of person who should be starting a business. And there seems to be this focus in our country about entrepreneurism and SMEs being something that everyone can just be and access. But you would know better than me what the other things are in terms of economic growth. And maybe you can also come in here about the informal economy as well.
Yeah, so one thing that Dr. Mbete said resonates particularly with me about the future of the mining industry. And I think it's absolutely correct that there is, like, the terms of technological innovation that you can transfer to other areas is just limited in that sector, and more so in that sector than in other sectors. But we have another part of the primary sector, which is agriculture. And in agriculture, actually, South Africa has a really good position.
Yeah.
In particular, when you think about things like organic produce and organic fruits, we are particularly well suited to be world leading in that specific area because we do have the necessary natural resources for this. We do have the necessary just human, like it's just a manpower, a woman power thing that you need in order to have good organic products. I think that's something that should be pushed much more from Team SA internationally, and we should focus much more on these really labor-intensive sort of high quality foodstuffs that we can then export. This is bringing money in the right direction. The other area which always baffled me why we are not sort of more active on this is when it comes to healthcare. South Africa has a world-class private healthcare system. Why we're not importing old people from Europe, I don't understand. Have their sunset lives, live out here, have their friends and family come over. It's the same time zone, you know, with Zoom and everything. It's super easy to manage. It would be very manual labor intensive, because sort of care for the elderly is by its very definition manual labor intensive. So this is a clear growth area where we already have a strength that we are not exploring. And I think it has to do with government being stuck in this old romantic world. And not just government, the same can apply to other political parties. Julius is still stuck in the 19th century and in sort of his workers' revolution. And even if they raise like valid issues on some of the points, the way they think about them is just like, it's just not applicable anymore. The world has changed. It's not a matter of political agreeing or disagreeing. It's just your diagnosis is wrong, you know? And that's a challenge, because in no other discipline than in politics do empty promises get you that far. But even in politics, empty promises eventually will catch up. And that's going to be challenging. So what we need is a reliable government partner. And I can just make one example when it comes to innovation and what stifles it. When COVID hit us, a team of my students, we set up to build a contact tracing solution for people without smartphones, because all the sort of the first world digital contact tracing always requires smartphones. But 55% of South Africans don't have a smartphone. In fact, the majority of the world population does not have a smartphone. So while it's nice that the Discovery app that the president and Zweli Mkhize pushed protects white people from COVID, it doesn't do anything for those who live in townships and who live with feature phones or no phone at all. It is a problem for something like COVID if you have a solution only for one part of society. You need, by its very nature, you need to have something that works for everybody. So it needs to be radically inclusive. So we built this platform that does contact tracing for people without smartphone, and we raised about 2 million rand from an NGO that supported this as a grant. We built this whole thing out. It's completely privacy preserving, and we desperately tried to get a hold of somebody within a Department of Health to just pay attention and have a discussion. And it was like we literally sent thousands of emails and phone calls. We hired someone just to follow up with people to make sure that they actually get the message. And it was like we offered it completely for free. Like we said, look, this is a good innovation. It'll work in a lot of African countries. Make this, you know, innovation made in SA. It's open source. It's free. We'll give it to you. You can take it over. Do whatever you want with it. We just want to make sure that people are included, and that it was impossible to get a hold of anybody. Government. This reliable partner, I think this is really something that's missing. And it's not just within government. I think the same actually, like we did have better experience in the Western Cape, but not orders of magnitude better. So in the Western Cape, we got one response for every 100 emails or so, which is, you know, this is orders of magnitude better, but it still didn't solve the problem. I think it's important that we have, you know, political leaders that understand where the true challenges are, that have an, you know, non-romanticized view of the problems that we have, and then address them, be it sort of energy generation. It is beyond me how Gwede Mantashe is still allowed to wreak havoc. Why we not have set out 10 years ago, 5 years ago, to massively push renewable energy, because the moment it got cheaper than coal, there's no excuse anymore to not push this with everything we have. It solves the energy generation problem. It solves the energy distribution problem, because it can be locally generated. Yeah. So you can have townships, and you can have entrepreneurs. We have a company called, I think it's Sun Express, where they generate local renewable energy. You invest in it, sort of in peer-to-peer lending. It's a completely new business model, made in South Africa, very, very successful. That doesn't get the adoption that it needs, because we live in this sort of old world, and it really, I think it needs a generational shift in our leadership in order to just be attuned and understand that the world around us is different.
I just want to
Please, go for it.
I just want to extend on something that Prof. Georg has said, and there's a generational difference also in terms of the way in which we think of the status of certain types of economic activity, or so that there's this desire always to do things like they're done in the developed world, or have a smartphone app. Yes. Or it's the same with informal work, right? So a lot of people who are employed in the informal sector still don't think of themselves as employed. So someone will say, someone who's working as a car guard will say, "We are panda." They're trying, but they're actually employed, and they are providing a service, and they're getting remunerated for it, sometimes far better than they would be if they were in formal employment. And so I think that we have a societal issue around the status we allocate to certain types of economic activity, and also to certain types of solutions. So having a basic non-smartphone app isn't cool or edgy or whatever it is. And so no one wants to take that seriously, because it means admitting that, we're not this hugely sophisticated country, but where those solutions actually are really sophisticated and appropriate for our context. And I think it's the same even with going to a TVET college, that people don't want to do that because it's low status, and it's, even though you're probably going to get much better remunerated with those kinds of skills than you would do in level service work. And so there's a real need for a paradigm shift about not judging ourselves for kind of what the reality is of the country, and then working from there to say, well, how do we improve it in a way that is good and inclusive of everyone?
I agree. So who does this paradigm shift? Is it you as a lecturer who is shaping young minds? Is it me at my rallies? Is it our institutions? And I think, here, maybe I could ask you, Dr. Mbete, what role should our institutions be playing, not just in terms of economic growth, but in the idea that we have to change a lot of paradigm shifts in our society. And so one of the things that I've always noticed about political parties is that they are very scared to talk about anything that doesn't fall under the ambit of strict policy or legislation. But for example, we're not going to solve the questions of even things like, the femicide we see or the patriarchy we see if we aren't having conversations about what is happening in the home. But people get very iffy about talking about those kinds of conversations, and they hope that some institution is going to do it, or some, social worker or some school or something. But who is supposed to be helping drive this paradigm shift? Who's responsible for it in your idea? And what role should our institutions be playing?
Look, in terms of institutions, I think that what we forget, and I think that what's happened, around, let's say, like the state capture narrative around the, capturing the work of law enforcement institutions or of governance institutions, is that we talk about institutions as if they're good in and of themselves. When institutions serve an enabling function, they are meant to make things easier and provide a predictable, consistent, accessible way of managing relations in society, whether those are political relations or whether those are economic relations or anything else. And the problem that we've gotten to is that many of our institutions are inaccessible unless you've got connections. And so the story that Prof. Georg was talking about with this, and as a person in a pretty high status role in terms of, associate professor at UCT, in this chair, with the right email and email signature to get people to look. But even then it became impossible to try and get anyone in an institution to look at your work. And so the big issue, I think, with many of our institutions, whether it's law enforcement institutions, whether it's economic institutions, even educational institutions, and then certainly around many of our political institutions, is that there's so many barriers to entry and barriers to access that are based on a whole number of factors, and we need to address those barriers if we want to be able to enable the smooth operation of our economy. The second thing is that, and linked to what I'd said earlier around policies and sort of policy dysfunction or policy or inertia, is that many of our institutions are struggling to do the work that they need to do. So ICASA, for example, isn't fit for purpose. It was an institution that was put together in response, to regulate broadcast and a very 20th century view of technology and communications technology. We've now moved on. And the tech landscape is completely different. And so you've got this regulatory institution that hasn't kept up with the times, and so can't act with the kind of urgency that's necessary to implement the policies that we need for our economies to grow and to create the kinds of jobs we need to. You see the same thing with the Labour Department. So we had the Minister of Labour admitting during the early stages of the COVID-19 crisis that the Labour Department doesn't have a framework to deal with freelancers. So you were talking about informal work, and yes, our informal sector, our government still does not have a framework with which to deal with the informal sector. And so, and I haven't seen from other political parties any alternative way or framework of thinking about the informal sector. How do we think of labor in the informal sector? How do we think of taxation, of regulation, of anything like that? And the bulk of people in our country are employed informally. And then you have, even with freelancers, which is slightly, which I suppose is a different kind of class of informal worker, our Labour Department had no mechanism for it, even though these are people that contribute taxes, that pay taxes, that can, and they couldn't access any support like a UIF from the Labour Department. And so I think that the problem with many of our institutions is that they're not agile and they're not responsive and they're not actually fit for purpose. And we need to, and that there's an important role for political parties to play in using the power and the access that they have to push those changes in our regulatory institutions.
And I mean, that's assuming that political parties themselves are not stuck in the 20th or 19th century way of thinking, which I sometimes really do find to be the case. I've been speaking about the informal sector, and I'll be honest, I hadn't even thought about freelancers in that way, but even in general, even as I've been speaking about the informal sector, it seems to be something that is so, out of the idea of what people think a political party should be speaking about. But for me, even from a purely cynical point of being able to go out and convince people to vote for you, it's a huge chunk of people that you're leaving out of the conversation of the politics of the day in the country. That's a huge voting base, even if you were just, somebody who was purely just cynical about why you were doing it. But from a point of view of our country having some sort of stability and sustainability going forward, it should be something that we're thinking about. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and for people that are watching, you can now ask questions. I know I've been asking a lot and I could go on forever, but I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. My team will be feeding them to me, and until we see some questions coming up on the Facebook Live, I want to shift a little bit and ask maybe something that is an interest to me and is something that my party has been speaking about, but it's something that is interesting to South Africans. So we have this idea of BEE or triple BEE, and the idea that we should be using race as a proxy. We have this idea that there's definitely racial inequality in terms of the way people's spatial planning has been done in this country, in the way that most people are in the positions that they are, whether they're Black, colored, or Indian, predominantly because of the racial relations of this country for the last 400 years. But increasingly, you're also seeing a position where people who should be advantaged, whether they're young or whether they come from communities that were previously advantaged, are finding themselves being disadvantaged, I suppose, in South Africa now. Firstly, and this is a question to both of you, should we still be discussing race as a proxy? Are we wrong in that it seems to be the fact that people only focus about it from an employment perspective, whereas there's so much racial inequality in the way that our country is structured, even just in terms of where people live, for example, or whether there's even businesses or special economic zones that can contribute to getting those people out of there. Are we too narrowly focused? I think we are. I think we get very stuck in this idea of BE being the only thing that's of racial inequality in this country. But is that something that's still happening? Should we be doing it? My party has taken a very specific view to it, as has the ANC. I'd like your critical thoughts on that particular question, because I think that it's something that people like to skirt around, but it's something that we actually need to decide as a country whether we're going to see that we still have racial inequality that has to be addressed without, of course, scapegoating or disadvantaging, particularly people in my generation who, in some ways may have been privileged and may have generational wealth, but are increasingly finding themselves in a position of not being able to access the job markets in South Africa. Let me start with you, Professor, please.
Yeah, I don't, so as a foreigner coming here about 10 years ago, I don't fully understand sort of all the intricacies of it. But what I have seen is that there still seems, like when I look at my students, when I look at the economy, there still seems to be a persistence of race as a proxy for being disadvantaged. Obviously, it doesn't hold for everybody. Like you can have sort of a young Black student having grown up with lots of privilege and a poor white student not. Statistically, though, there is a big difference between the two groups. And I see it in every measure when they come to university. So one of the big sort of advantages of university is that they act as an equalizer. We try to get everybody to the same starting line so that they can then run a fair race and sort of compete with one another and sort of move everything forward. I don't fully understand the obsession with why it should be a bad indicator. Coming from Germany, we had a divided country for 34 years. We had reunification, and we said, there's a very simple proxy that we can use to measure where privilege was and where disadvantages was. Disadvantages tend to be in the Northeast, privilege tends to be in the Southwest, so we need a transfer of wealth between the two groups. And we created a special tax that is paid by every German equally, that goes for infrastructure projects in the East. And we've paid this for, I think, 30 years. It's now ending slowly after billions of euros have been invested in the East. Here we have a similar proxy. It's not East and West, but it is race. And we don't have a same discussion around why shouldn't we use this as an indicator to see where previous disadvantage needs to be compensated. I don't understand why there hasn't been a much more concerted sort of drive to invest in areas that have been previously disadvantaged. I think a lot has to do with when you speak about the informal sector, we only see the informal sector sort of as a problem. We need to make sure they pay taxes. We need to make sure that they do everything within regulation, but it's also a huge opportunity. One of the most innovative companies I've seen in Cape Town is called Lumkani. They offer fire insurance for townships. It's one of the first products in the world that does it. And it works with a meshed network of fire detectors. It's super sophisticated, it's super resilient, and it scales globally. This comes out of an informal settlement, of an informal area. It's not just a problem, it's a huge potential that we can tap into. And we need to embrace it as such. But it only works if there's sort of a level playing field that people can compete with. Otherwise, you get discouraged, you just continue to be disadvantaged, and we don't put our best ideas forward. We simply can't afford this disadvantage anymore, and we should do more to address it. I think if we find a proxy that works, we should use it, because otherwise it's a very complicated problem. And we have a proxy that works, so why not use it? So I think the DA was wrong in having the heated debate about this particular item, and then the decision, I think, was not easily operationalizable. Right?
Yeah.
Like, here we have something, we can use it to measure. Why on earth wouldn't we use it to measure where the problem is?
Okay, Dr. Mbete, can you come in? Because then I have a follow-up very interesting question.
Sure. I completely agree with Prof. And I think that it's good to hear from a German about the experience of Germany and the kind of redress measures that were taken after the unification. And that was suggested for South Africa. So one of the findings of the TRC, one of the recommendations of the TRC's report was that there be a wealth tax, and they thought of it as a once-off wealth tax. To be paid, and the government just never took it up. The Mbeki government at the time just never followed up on that. And there's been this real, and I think that it's partly because we've chosen to see our the reconciliation as an end in itself. That apartheid didn't end in a massive civil war as was predicted. Has been seen as the end.
Yeah.
And without an acknowledgement that actually just gives us, that actually was just giving us a good start to be able to then rebuild and redress, to build something, a different kind of South Africa, which we haven't done. And so, the spatial disparity for me is the big thing. And what we basically did is that those Black people who could move into traditionally white areas, but we did nothing, or previously white areas, but we did nothing to improve the conditions of predominantly Black areas, but also we did nothing to make those previously white dominated areas not white dominated anymore. And so there's been a real resistance to having any kind of spatial transformation of South Africa. And what that's done is that it then just reinforces privilege along those geographic lines and along racial lines. What it also does is that it, for me, one of the biggest upward pressures on wages in South Africa is transport, because people are needing to travel so far to get to work, and it costs so much to get to work. And people are spending 40%, 60% of their wage on transport. And so how do you expect people to save, to build up any wealth, to be productive members of the economy, if so much money is going towards transport? And now we have a situation where that money isn't just going to transport of the parents who are working, or caregivers who are working, it's also going to transport of kids to get them from township and rural schools into town schools, because we haven't invested sufficiently in education in those places. And so, and I think that it's about seeing this not as punishment, which I think is what the DA's view of it has been. It's not about punishing white people for anything from before, it's about creating a functional society, because as the Prof said, with something like COVID-19, you can't have a COVID-19 solution that works for one part of the population and not for the other part of the population, because the disease spreads. And it's the same, I think, for economic development. You can't think of developing one part of your economy and leaving the rest of it, because the problems that are caused by economic disadvantage spread. And I'm even watching my own language, right? That we speak about poor communities, about people that have been left behind as problems, when they're not. It's, there's the people are equal productive parts of our economy, and we need to have an economy that, harnesses everybody's potential, not just that of a few.
I agree. And for me, it's a very emotive issue, because you can't go and speak to people if you're not going to tell them that you understand their lived realities. And I think it's going to be incredibly difficult when you say that you don't understand that some of their lived realities are because of the color of their skin in this country. And it's something that we are going to have to take on board. But I'm going to ask, I know we're running out of time, and we have some questions that people have sent in. And one of those is, I suppose, going from this conversation that we're speaking about, and I'll ask you, Professor Georg, is, so if we're saying all of this, and if we are understanding that these are the problems, Why then has South Africa not taken something on like the universal basic income sort of grants? Is it because we already have so many grants? But at the same time, you know, an average male who is 18 until they're 55 can't really access any of those grants themselves. So you're really leaving them in a position where they might not get any work for 40 years of their life and then have to be pressurized into getting into some of the social ills that, you know, Dr. Mbete has just spoken about. Why is this not something that we are taking on as a country? It's been proven to be able to work in other countries. I know that we have a lot of debt servicing that we're doing, but is it even a possibility for South Africa? And this is a question that somebody's asked us on our Facebook, which I was going to cover anyway, but I really think it's something that's interesting. Why are we not looking at something like that? Because it might help alleviate some poverty. It might help people be able to even start their own businesses or whatever the case might be. But it's certainly more dignified than just having someone sitting in the, you know, shack as South Africa is, just kind of waiting until they're old enough to be able to get a grant.
Yeah, so this has been discussed as an idea in several countries, and I think with the economy changing back like away from work that lasts a lifetime and that sort of one career per person to sort of interrupted careers, many jobs, some concurrently, sort of the fractionalization of work that will fuel this debate again. There's one advantage of having a UBI that I think people don't talk about enough, and that is it gives people the freedom to innovate. You can't innovate if you fear that you will starve. I spent a year at MIT. The big difference that I saw there between their students and our students is that their students don't have to worry about sending money home. This gives them they are as bright as ours. Maybe there's some, you know, true genius outstanding with whatever. But on average, I think as bright as ours, but they have the freedom to experiment and to play and to try things and to fail. Yeah. That doesn't exist. My students, they need to graduate, they need to get out, they need to get a job, not because they are so keen on working 10 hours, 12 hours a day. They are keen to be able to send money home. That's the reality on the ground. The UBI would fix a lot of these issues. The one challenge with it is the financing. Even if you just take the 350 Rand COVID grants and you scale it to 58 million people, 12 months a year, that's 243 billion. I did the math before, not just 243 billion that we would have to pay annually for this grant. That's about 20% of our total tax income. Yeah. So probably we can raise taxes a little bit, especially on the wealthy who are exceptionally well off in South Africa. We can raise taxes a little bit, modest increase. Probably we can save a bunch of money if we cut back the public sector wage bill and if we make government more efficient. Still, the question then is this 350 Rand a month enough to cover the basics? And I fail to see that, to be honest. I think for this to work, you would have to have something that is broader. And I think that should be focused probably more on young people as they leave school and start looking for work, as opposed to everybody. That in itself would make the numbers much more palatable. And you can go to something like 1,000 Rand with a modest tax increase, modest savings. So you move this whole discussion much more in a realistic, it's not universal, but I think that's the discussion that we should have. And there's been so much wealth transferred from future generations to past generations. I think a UBI for future generations, I think that is definitely something that should be considered because it transfers money in the right direction.
Dr. Mbete, I don't know if you want to come in there and maybe you could also just, you know, touch on, you know, the experience of what you have heard about things like UBIs, or even if it's possible. I think I agree with the professor that it can't be for everyone. But at the same time, all three of us here are probably considered part of the 1%. But I can tell you now, we're probably paying out of our asses for security, education, whatever it is. So, I mean, we can propose something like this, particularly for young people to help them. But if it's going to be about increasing taxes of people that are considered wealthy on paper, in South Africa, we also know that that isn't always the case because of how overly taxed we already are. Is that going to be something that's palatable? Or how do we balance those two different, you know, interest groups at this point?
Look, Mbali, for you and me, I mean, yes, we're paying for security and whatever else it is, but we're also paying a huge amount of money to support unemployed people of our families.
Yeah.
And with, you know, and so if this would be a UBI would, I don't like the term black tax, but I think that would, you know, would relieve, I think, a lot of that for many people. And I lived in France for just less than a year. And one of the things that I found, now I was 23 and 4, I think, when I lived there, and I could get it. There was a train card, a carte 1225, for to use the train for people between the ages of 12 and 25, and you paid like 70% off train journeys, both local ones, but also long distance ones. And so what that meant is that if you were a school leaver in France, and then so besides having that card for transport access, that there were all sorts of structures available to help young people look for work, or to, you know, to place people in employment, or to give whatever kind of work experience. And I think that we've made it incredibly difficult for young people in South Africa to join any kind of economic activity if they don't have connections, and if they don't come from a particular socioeconomic background. And we need to make it easier for people to become economically active. And, you know, we talk so much about matriculants who don't have work, but what about the 500,000 kids who leave school between 16, so not even the graduates, 500,000 kids leave school between the ages of 16 and 18. So before they matriculate, so after it's compulsory to be at school, but before you hit matric, what is available for those young people to actually become productive members of society? And so I think that having some kind of basic income grant for young people between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 25 or whatever, would be really useful and really helpful, because at the moment our economy and our grant system is enabling for you over the age of 60, or if you have a child.
Yeah.
Or if you are disabled.
Yeah.
And that, you know, those are important sectors of society to assist, of course. But we can't have a system that provides no cushion, no help at all for people in their most productive years of life. And I think that we need to start thinking about things in those ways. And I think that's why I don't like the sense of the term of a basic income grant. Talking about a universal basic income, I think, is far more appropriate. When we talk about a grant, it makes it seem like charity.
Yeah.
But this is actually an enabling and an important intervention for economic growth and economic development.
And then, of course, we can bring in education about how people should be trying to use that grant. And you'll have a few people who will start with maybe, you know, spending it on, I don't know, parties or whatever. But like in any society, like we had when we started the education around using condoms and that kind of thing, you'll have a few people that don't do it, but eventually people will get the hang of it. And then you'll start seeing people actually doing really amazing things with that kind of grants. So I've got a question from Paul Egan, and I've got two more, and I'm so sorry, I know we've gone a little bit over time, but we've got streams of questions coming in. But one is, as a policy, would incentivizing companies via a tax break to create jobs not be a tool? Which I agree with, and it's part of the manifesto that I've written. But tax is such an interesting thing in this country. But certainly one of the things that I've been saying is that I really think we could incentivize businesses to go to villages, to go to townships, and really create the kind of spaces that would empower people in those communities. And we could incentivize it by giving them tax breaks. I mean, that's not anything off the government's back, but you'd be creating this mass pool of people that are able to anyway bring back into the tax base of South Africa by spending, by consumption-led growth, and by other things. I don't know if one of you want to talk about that. And then we've got another comment from Andre Spray, who says, look, obviously there's no doubt that race as a proxy could be scrapped, but or shouldn't be scrapped considering what this country has gone through. But the way that the government has implemented BBBE has allowed for the idea of redress to be exploited. And as a reason, because of this, people obviously have difficulties feeling that they're comfortable with BBE. And I mean, we've already spoken that it shouldn't just be taken to be about, redress shouldn't just be about the Black economic empowerment debate, it should be about so much more. But I don't know if both of you just want a quick 1 minute bite at both of those different questions. And I think what I'll do after this, because there's a lot of questions streaming in, is maybe just send them to you afterwards and we can speak about it. We've got too many questions that are coming in. But maybe I could give you, Prof, the first bites of those two.
Sure. So I think it's fine to criticize BBEE for everything that's wrong with it. I think that's different from saying you should scrap race as a proxy. For me, these are two logically different things. You can be against one, but you don't have to just deny the existence of race as a proxy, full stop. And I think that actually would help just to make the discussion about BBEE much more constructive, saying, okay, so what exactly, if you accept that race is a proxy, what exactly would you change? How exactly sort of does the alternative look like? And then I think we would be in a much more productive discussion. On the tax break for companies, I think there's something to be said about this if it remedies existing frictions in the market. And this is a super economist kind of way of thinking about this. But there are frictions that exist in the way that companies grow. If we just create a blank tax break for all companies, what you have is that companies who exist for a long time and haven't grown, they will make use of it and it will benefit the shareholders of the company. It will not lead to more growth. Empirically, this is the weirdest thing for me. The one thing that the DA, the ANC, and the EFF agree on is that we need to support SMMEs. They disagree on how to do it, but all three agree on that we need to do it. Empirically, I find no evidence that support for SMMEs leads to growth. It is the most mind-boggling thing ever. What does lead to growth is supporting young companies that just start out. So supporting startups, and in the first, 3-5 years of a company's existence, supporting them, either through tax breaks, but companies in the first 3 years, they don't pay taxes anyway, so very little. But supporting these companies, this will lead to job growth. This will incentivize innovation. This will make it possible for people to become entrepreneurs out of the informal sector or the formal sector. Just a blank tax break, I don't think, there's not enough evidence to support the idea that this actually will lead to a lot of positive spillovers. Young companies, very different story. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, and like seed funding and stuff. Dr. Mbete?
Yeah.
I just want to reinforce what has been said about supporting young companies. I think what's so interesting is that when you then have conversations about, or a lot of our parties, when they talk about supporting young companies or SMEs, there's a lot of obsession about incubators and building these big structures for, incubating startups, but nothing actually about what companies need to survive their first 3 years and employ and expand. So, whether that's access to finance or to being able to navigate legal issues and I think that that's a big issue, that many of the people who are making these policies aren't people that have tried to start a company or are not engaging constructively with people who have. I think just getting back to the BEE thing, I actually think part of the reason why BEE became and has become what it has done as just this elite creator is because we haven't had any other redress measures that have been worked sufficiently enough. So we've had basically the use of a redress policy, which is Black economic empowerment, which is about, and which has been mostly about transferring share ownership from white people to Black people. And all of that has done is that it's just reinforced and recreated the inequality of wealth spread in our country, just with a more racially diverse elite. But it hasn't done anything to fundamentally restructure the way in which wealth and income are distributed across the population of our country. And that's what we need. We need redress measures that are going to change that. And so the logics are different, but I actually think that part of the reason why BEE has become what it has done is because we've had an absence of any other meaningful economic redress policies. And so yeah, so, you know, we can speak against BE, but the issue is not the need for redress itself. And I think that we need to separate out those conversations in order to implement the kind of change we need to make South Africa's economy a functional one. Because for me, ultimately, the problem here is that we don't have a sustainable or functional economy. We didn't under colonialism or apartheid because the economy relied on repression and oppression, and people rose up against it. And now we just have an economy that still excludes so many people, and it's just not sustainable. And so we need to think differently about what a functional and a sustainable economy actually is in South Africa in the 21st century.
I want to thank you very much. I've got people swearing at me here to ask questions, but I know that you're incredibly busy people, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I do want to say from my perspective as somebody who's hosting the live and people that are asking, because I think two things that both the professor and Dr. Mbete just said, which was around even just the seed capital, the idea that you need to get young companies, which are between 3 to 5 years, to be able to. I had that in my manifesto, and I'm speaking now specifically to delegates in the DA. If we can't think about new ways of how to excite particularly young people, particularly people that have not looked at our party, I really want to encourage you to go look at some of the stuff that I've said, because I think it's been substantiated with what both these experts are saying. And I'm no economist myself, but this is basic logic from what you can see on the ground. So I'd really appreciate you being able to have a look at that. And we didn't get a lot of time to speak about it today, but in broad terms you did, which is really the stakeholder economy and how we try to take everyone forward with us as a democratic alliance. And that if you're going to be fixated on just the idea of BE and the inequality of that as a party, we're not going to reach the kind of people that we have to reach. We're not going to be able to speak about informal sectors. We're not going to be able to speak about young people who are predominantly right now being left out of the system. And I want us to change that. And this is why I'm running as your leader, and this is why I want us to be able to have these conversations. And they're difficult. You saw two experts here who have a lot to say, and there's still so much to say, but we have to start being on the side of getting that paradigm shift going, as Dr. Mbete has said, because otherwise we're just having the same platitudes, the same kind of speeches that we've seen coming from our president. And I just don't believe that we have the kind of time to be able to be polite about what it is that we're demanding now. And, you know, one of the things that people thought was going to happen in '94 was this bloodshed because of people being left out of the economy and the rights of being a part of, you know, civilized people in society. And I think that that's something that we could find ourselves growing and going towards if we aren't able to get everyone involved in the economy. And it can't be stressed enough how important it is, not just in terms of the dignity people have when they have a job and are able to provide for their kids or their family or give back in terms of black tax, but because of what societal ills emanate from that when people have no other option but to be forced into desperate situations. And I really want us as a party to not think of the economy from where we are, or predominantly we are traditional bases, but really about the people that are out there who don't even vote anymore because they've given up on any system being able to help them. And so I want to thank you very much, Dr. Mbete and Professor Georg, for really doing this. And I am going to make sure that I send you a recording so that you can also see what the people are saying on Facebook. Sorry to Mike Andrews and to Nongulu Mkize. I can see that you guys had just written some questions now, and the other people. But I hope that this is a conversation that people will be having themselves. And as your DA leader, this is a conversation that we're going to have with many more experts, and it's going to be ongoing because I think it's incredibly important. Thank you so much to my guests. I think you've both been amazing, and you've made the language in particular very accessible to people. And I think that, you know, whether I win or lose, that this is something that's been very valuable. I'm going to send it to all delegates that weren't able to join us today because I think it's an important conversation. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.